Speaking of Batman, in 1999 we were given the infamous No Man's Land arc. In this story, Gotham is struck by a massive earthquake and is cut off from the rest of the country. The government writes the city off as a lost cause, and the various villains form gangs and begin taking over areas of the city and claiming it as their territory. Batman has to work to bring order back to the city by working with his fellow local heroes as well as the GCPD. The concept seems simple enough, but what can make the story kind of convoluted is its sheer scale. No Man's Land was the most ambitious crossover in DC history, requiring the writers to develop maps and charts to keep track of where everyone was at any given time. The story was told across all of the Batman and Bat Family titles, such as Batman, Detective Comics, Shadow of the Bat, Legends of the Dark Knight, Robin, Catwoman, and Nightwing. The story spans over 100 issues of comics, making keeping up with the story when it came out an expensive and difficult to keep track of endeavor. Number 9. Crisis on Infinite Earths. By today's standards, Crisis on Infinite Earths isn't too convoluted. I mean, we're used to getting a crisis event every few years from DC, but the original is worth talking about. By 1986, the DC multiverse had gotten so convoluted that editorial decided that they needed a way to streamline continuity. The story is almost a last hurrah for the convoluted original continuity, with multiple versions of characters coming together to save the universe. As a result, there is a lot of people and storylines to keep track of before the multiverse is eventually destroyed, leaving only one Earth with all of the histories either being erased or combined. It's convoluted, but with the goal of becoming less convoluted by its end, which is a noble enough goal. Number 8. Green Lantern is difficult to start reading. I'm gonna be brief with this one, and it's more of a personal one. I really like the concept of the Green Lanterns, but every time I try and read any of their stories, I get confused. There are way too many members of the team who you are expected to follow, and then when you finally figure that out, you learn about the yellow, red, blue, and orange lanterns, each with a different emotional spectrum. Add to that the Guardians of the Universe and the central power battery containing a demon named Parallax who makes them unable to affect the color yellow, and there's just a lot to keep track of. I hear that a lot of their stories are really good, but their history is so convoluted and there is so much homework involved in understanding the lore that it makes Green Lantern a really intimidating title to pick up. Number 7. Superman's continuity. For decades, Superman operated in the New Earth continuity. This is the Superman who showed up in 1986, had the Death and Return arc, married Lois Lane, and had all those classic adventures. In 2011, DC rebooted into the New 52, featuring a different Superman who hadn't had those adventures and was dating Wonder Woman and all that stuff. It was different but easy enough to follow because it was a different continuity. Then, one day, things got weird, and the New Earth Superman showed up right as the New 52 Superman was dying, revealing that he had been transported to this universe with his Lois years prior along with their son John, and had been hiding out the whole time. So, he became the new old Superman. So we had New 52 heroes except Superman, who was the New Earth version. Eventually, to try and retcon this a bit, it was revealed that the two different Supermen were actually two halves of the real Superman. They merged into one person, thus combining their continuities. This was Rebirth era, where everyone was getting their continuities mixed a bit, but just when this was getting figured out, we got Infinite Frontier, where everything is canon if you want it to be. Now, this might be the most controversial thing I've ever said on this channel, but this stuff with Superman is a prime example of why canon is extremely overrated. Number 6. The X-Men, Marvel's most notoriously convoluted series. Despite their reputation, you can pick up an X-Men comic and start reading and not be too lost. But there is a lot going on that makes the story of the team difficult to keep a handle on. Besides the massive cast of characters who each have ridiculously intricate family trees, there are cosmic forces like the Phoenix Force to keep track of. Characters like Cable, who are coming in from alternate timelines. And just when you figure all that out, everyone moves to a living island that the bad mutants are put into a weird mental prison in. Individual arcs are okay to get into, but if you look at the story of the X-Men as a whole, it is hard to deny that they have a pretty convoluted history. Speaking of the X-Men, number 5. Wolverine Origins. Wolverine has been alive for a very, very long time, and as a result, he has been through a lot, giving him a very complicated family history. For a long time, his history was a mystery, but over time, it got over-explained. In 2006, Marvel created a series called Wolverine Origins, which was about Wolverine discovering elements from his past, including how linked he is to other characters. This isn't a bad thing, but it doesn't really add to the character's mythos in any meaningful meaningful way. For example, he discovers that James Hudson of Alpha Flight, who was one of the first people to help Logan after his Weapon X experiment, was actually one of his cousins. Not only that, but Hudson's half-brother was actually Professor Thornton, the man who captured Wolverine and experimented on him to give him his metal claws. What an interesting revelation. One of his best friend's brothers is one of his worst enemies. Does it ever come up or have any impact on the plot? No, but it sure made his family tree more complicated. The story is filled with these kinds of revelations, which don't really impact the character and have the same energy as Dark Helmet telling Lone Star that he is his father's brother's nephew's cousin's former roommate. It just means absolutely nothing. Number 4, One More Day. Despite the fact that the Spider-Man movies basically just keep telling the same stories over and over again, with a very standard status quo, Spider-Man has grown a lot as a character since he was first introduced. He graduated high school pretty early in his history, and married Mary Jane Watson eventually. They were expecting a child, but MJ had a miscarriage. Peter was a teacher for a while, and during the events of Civil War, he actually revealed his secret identity to the world. Marvel editorial looked at all of this character growth and went, "Blah! Ugh! How do we get back to the status quo people expect?" Their solution was One More Day. In this reviled story, Aunt May is dying, and Peter wants to do anything to save her. The demon Mephisto shows up and offers to save May's life in exchange for Peter and MJ's marriage never having happened. He also makes it so no one remembers that Peter is Spider-Man. The couple accepts the deal and wake up with no memories of their marriage. Now, this has caused a lot of confusion over the years regarding the canon. Basically, stuff like the marriage and miscarriage never happened because Mephisto altered time, but all of the adventures that Spider-Man had were still canon, but were affected by a memory wipe. So stuff like the Clone Saga, that relies on the couple's marriage being a major plot point, happened, but slightly differently, I guess? Oh, and Civil War happened. Everyone just forgot that Spider-Man revealed his identity. The actual story is easy enough to follow, but the long-term effects it has on the character's history are really difficult to nail down, and not really worth it, as its only purpose was to get Spidey back to his roots as a lonely single guy, rather than exploring the character and allowing him to grow. Thanks, I hate it. Number 3, The Death and Return of Superman. When someone decides to start reading Superman comics, one of the first comics they are probably looking forward to reading is The Death and Return of Superman. Now, even if you are totally caught up with all of the Superman continuity, at that point, there's a lot going on in this story to try and keep track of. There's all the various replacement Supermen to keep track of, like the new Superboy, who is a clone of the original and Lex Luthor, the cyborg Superman, who's really an astronaut who Superman slighted at some point, the Eradicator, who turns out to be a Kryptonian robot designed to protect Superman, and Steel, who is honestly the easiest new character in this to keep track of. Then there's the element of Superman not really being dead, but actually being in a weird Kryptonian coma that he's healing from, and it all culminating in the city from the Green Lantern comics blowing up. Adding to all of this, the story takes place in a very specific era of Superman continuity. So if you're someone who's just skimming the classics but is familiar with the classic version of these characters, there's a lot of weird stuff happening that could be confusing. For example, at this point, Supergirl is a shape-shifting blob named Matrix, who is dating Lex Luthor, who has transferred his mind into a younger version of himself who has long red hair and is claiming to be the long-lost son of Lex Luthor from Australia. Number 2, The Clone Saga. The Clone Saga was a long-running event in Spider-Man comics that ran from 1994 all the way to 1996. It tells the story of Spider-Man's clone Ben Reilly coming back to town as a series of other clones show up to fight. They discover that Ben is actually the original and Peter is the clone, prompting Peter to retire as Ben takes over the superhero duties, and then it's eventually revealed that Green Goblin had manipulated the whole thing in a very weird plan, and that Peter was in fact the original and Ben was in fact the clone. This series is convoluted more for editorial issues happening at the time. The story was meant to go on for a year, but was selling so well that the team was told to keep it going an extra year, forcing them to come up with increasingly crazy plot twists. The original intent was for Ben Reilly to stay as Spider-Man, as Marvel was once again trying to undo his marriage so they could get him back back to basics. They eventually changed their minds, fearing fan reaction, and there was constant fights about the direction of the story, with Green Goblin both being alive and responsible being forced on the writers by editorial. To make things worse, all these problems made the story so convoluted that in order for any of it to make sense, people had to read an additional book called the Osborn Journal, which was just completely dedicated to the Goblin explaining his plan so that it even remotely made sense to the reader. Number 1. Hawkman's origin story. Hawkman has one of the most notoriously difficult origins to keep track of in all of comics, so I will be giving you an abridged version of his history. In his original 1940 origin, he is Egyptian royalty who has been reincarnated throughout time as a variety of different heroes before eventually becoming the archaeologist Carter Hall, spelled like this. Carter becomes Hawkman and fights crime. With me so far? When reintroduced in 1961, he is an alien cop from the planet Thanagar named Carter Hall, spelled like this. He comes to Earth and takes on the secret identity of an archaeologist named Carter Hall, with the original spelling. It makes sense when you think of him as a total reinvention of the original character. Where things start to get confusing is 2 years later when we learn that the two different versions are actually multiversal variants of each other, with the alien living on Earth 1 and the original being on Earth 2. In 1986, the Crisis on Infinite Earths happens, and all the worlds are combined into one. How to handle the continuity? Well, they changed it so that they were two different people who just happened to have similar sounding names and were both Hawkman at different points in history, with the original Egyptian prince version operating in the 40s and the alien space cop operating in the 80s. In 1994, Zero Hour happens, and all the various Hawkmen become one guy, but it doesn't stick. In 2011, the New 52 retcons Hawkman so that he is and always has been a space cop from Thanagar. In 2017, Carter with a C is reintroduced, with it being explained that he reincarnates because the knife he was killed with in Egypt was made of nth metal from a Thanagarian ship, kinda introducing elements of both origins. In 2018, we learned that the two versions have become one again, with the space cop being just one of Carter with a C's many reincarnations, retconning the character to be able to be reborn not just in different eras on Earth, but on different planets as well. So to sum it up briefly, reincarnated Pharaoh becomes space cop, becomes two different people. He is retconned to have only ever been a space cop and is retconned one last time to be a reincarnated Pharaoh who in one of his lives was an alien space cop. Which when you say it like that makes perfect sense. By the way, most of this also applies to Hawkgirl.
Coming in at number 10 is The Many Lives of Donna Troy. So some of the entries on this list won't be so much about single storylines, but even the stories of some comic book characters in whole, particularly those who seem to have multiple different lives. For example, Donna Troy. Donna, like Wonder Woman, has several different origin stories, but while Diana's many beginnings are pretty similar to one another in a few ways, the story behind Donna gets more puzzling with each retcon. Donna has been an orphan found and raised on Themyscira as Diana's younger sister, and then she was changed to a creation from part of Wonder Woman's soul, and then she even became a young mirror image clone of Wonder Woman. In the pre-Flashpoint era, Donna got a new origin story that completely changed the previous one every couple of decades. It was so confusing that the new Teen Titans had a story arc called Who is Donna Troy from 1988 to 89 to try and clean everything up. But even the story to clean up the character was retconned. In the end, all these separate threads of Donna finally came together. She was revealed to be an amalgamation of all the Donna Troys across the universe thanks to a spell, with all her origin stories being memories of her other lives. Yes, it is very confusing. Just don't pay attention. Number 9. Pax Americana. Grant Morrison and Frank Quietly created the Multiversity Pax Americana in 2014, and DC Comics fans were mostly baffled. As part of the Multiversity series of books, different universes based on companies purchased by DC Comics were explored in their own stories, but this one focused on Earth 4, which is based on the Charlton Comics heroes of Pax Americana. Hence the name. We saw characters like Peacemaker, The Question, Blue Beetle, all that fun stuff, but in a story that almost seemed like a mirror of the Watchmen story with the Charlton characters standing in. The story was also told basically in reverse, but also not really. Ultimately, it all revolves around the president that formed the Pax Americana and the mystery of whatever happened to America's first crime fighter. It's worth a read for sure, and after the initial read through, when you're confused about what's going on, I would maybe look up a guide on how to read it properly and read it again. Number 8. Jean Grey. While Jean Grey coming back from the Dark Phoenix saga was one of the greatest X-Men moments of all time, it was still just a tad tiny bit convoluted. Basically, it all kicks off when out in space, the X-Men were bombarded with cosmic radiation. While the other members were incapacitated, Jean Grey towed the line between life and death but managed to return everyone alive by making a sort of pact with the Phoenix Force. She was now much stronger and was reborn as the Phoenix. This led to the Phoenix Saga, where by the end of it, Jean as the Phoenix basically saved the multiverse. Unfortunately, it also eventually led to the Dark Phoenix Saga, which told the story of the fall of Jean Grey to Dark Phoenix thanks to the manipulation of the Hellfire Club, which inadvertently subjected the Phoenix Force to emotional concepts it never experienced before. Jean basically went out and destroyed an entire solar system in her rage at being manipulated. After events with the Shi'ar and the X-Men, Jean sacrificed herself in order to save the universe from the Dark Phoenix she had become and was completely atomized. It was incredibly sad and the story itself was really good, but then, years later in Fantastic Four number 286, it was revealed that Jean Grey had somehow actually been alive this entire time, and the being that actually went through the Phoenix and Dark Phoenix sagas was just the Phoenix Force itself that took on Jean's form. Jean herself was instead placed in a cocoon in Jamaica Bay, which is where she was reborn into the Phoenix originally. This brought the fan favorite character back to life, but devalued the whole Phoenix and Dark Phoenix sagas for fans and made people hate Jim Shooter, Marvel's editor-in-chief at the time. Number 7. Odyssey. Wonder Woman Odyssey feels almost like a DC Elseworlds story. Like it shouldn't fit into the main timeline, which itself is pretty damn confusing. But it definitely isn't an Elseworlds story. Odyssey was another of DC's attempts to reboot Wonder Woman, erasing all the continuity that had been in the series since Crisis on Infinite Earths, giving us a Diana who had no connection to anyone she had been interacting with for years in the comics. The story it tells isn't too convoluted itself. It drops us into the middle of the action, making it feel like we have missed a good chunk of the story, but it goes on to tell a pretty linear line of storytelling. It's just so disjointed from the rest of pretty much anything else. But then it was basically completely unnecessary because the same year that Odyssey ended, the entire DC universe was rebooted with Flashpoint and the New 52, with nothing about Diana's new reboot being carried over. Number 6. Marvel 1602. Neil Gaiman's Marvel 1602 is one of my favorite comic book stories, but I will admit it can be a little confusing. Basically, to lay it all out, the universe that it takes place in is Earth 311, which actually got its start in a different alternate reality. On Earth 460, Purple Man used his powers of persuasion to become president for life. In that world, most heroes had been hunted down or had died from old age, but Captain America was one holdout. Unfortunately, he is captured and banished away to Earth 616's 1599, but because he showed up in the world, it inadvertently created Earth 311. For some reason, the presence of Captain America destabilized reality and began the emergence of heroes and villains into this world who are counterparts to many of the present-day heroes and villains of the Marvel 616 universe. We have Count Otto von Doom the Handsome, Witchbreed, aka Mutants, Grand Inquisitor Enrique, aka Magneto, Carlos Javier, aka Charles Xavier, Four from the Fantastic, Sir Nicholas Fury, Peter Parquois, David Banner. These are some of the alternate versions of these characters. Now the story is super interesting, intertwining actual history with superpowered beings, but it's not without its confusing moments, and most of that has to do with how this story's world even came to be. Number 5. Doom Patrol. Doom Patrol has been around for a long time, and some people believe the X-Men are actually a ripoff of Doom Patrol since they were around first. There are a lot of things in these comics that make them just out of this world to read, from the conflicts themselves to the villains and even some of the heroes, including a hero that is a sentient teleporting street. Some of the other characters featured include the Beard Hunter, a Punisher kind of character that wages a lonely war against facial hair, the Quiz, a supervillain that has every superpower you haven't thought of, and Flex Mentallo, who uses his power of muscle mystery to turn the Pentagon into a circle. It's just wild, but it's not a bad story by any means, don't get me wrong. It's incredibly thought-provoking and really entertaining to read, but that's only when it isn't confusing. Some of the conflicts we see the Doom Patrol in are just wild. For example, in one storyline, the Brotherhood of Dada ended up trapping all of Paris in a painting, and the Doom Patrol go jumping into that painting, eventually teaming up with the Brotherhood to defeat the fifth horseman of the apocalypse that then gets transformed into a kid's rocking horse. The confusingness of this comic, I think, comes more so from a place of just trying to believe what you're reading half the time. Number 4, Final Crisis. If we are talking confusing, then you know one of DC Comics' many crisis events will make the list. Last time we spoke about the Crisis on Infinite Earths, but this time we're going to be talking about the Final Crisis, which isn't actually the final one. You may not be surprised at this point to hear that this confusing story was also plotted out by our friend Grant Morrison, who seems to be responsible for more than half of the stories on this list. For Final Crisis though, there are a few things that just make it confusing as hell. Basically, the story sees Darkseid invade the Earth. That's normal, but it's when the anti-life equation becomes involved that things go all over. In the build-up to Final Crisis, Morrison gave DC a very rough outline of the book so they could do a build-up, but they had their own ideas on what the book should be, so they tailored the build-up to what they thought Final Crisis should be, and Morrison completely ignored everything that DC did. So the build-up is basically useless. The 7 issues that make up the actual story, however, are very hard to follow with the perspective of the story and which characters are involved, jumping from panel to panel and page to page. There are so many different characters involved, some of which are hella obscure, or are returning with no explanation like Barry Allen. I mean, Superman defeats the villain by singing. That's what we're dealing with here. Singing Superman. Number 3, Power Girl. Thanks to Crisis on Infinite Earths, we talked about in part 1, many characters were changed and one of them was Power Girl, and it wasn't for the better. So essentially, after Crisis on Infinite Earths, Kara was no longer the cousin of Superman. Instead, Kara's background was completely altered. With Earth 2 no longer existing, Kara's origin was altered and she was now the granddaughter of the Atlantean sorcerer, Arion, and had been frozen in suspended animation for millennia until the present day, making her actually an Atlantean. She got a brand new costume, and for a really long time she believed that she belonged under the sea, speaking with fish and chilling with Aquaman. This remained the same all the way until Infinite Crisis, when Earth 2 and the original Superman was brought back. Kara learned that it was apparently all a trick, and Kara had indeed been a Kryptonian all along. The Psycho Pirate showed Kara multiple versions of her origin in an effort to drive her insane, but eventually revealed that she was not only Kryptonian, but also a survivor of the entire Earth 2 universe, and she regained her memories when she met Lois Lane Kent. And then we have Supergirl, who is also an alternate reality version of the same person, and we're not going to talk about that. Number 2, Generations. The DC Elseworld stories are some of my favorite ones, because largely, the stories are self-contained. Doesn't mean they can't be convoluted though. Elseworld's Generations is a great example. Generations basically gets rid of the idea of comic book time, following Batman and Superman's first appearances in the 1930s and then onward in real time. The two heroes basically remain unchanged throughout time, which makes sense for Superman, but for the Dark Knight, he exists forever because he essentially becomes the immortal Ra's al Ghul. It's not too bad, but it's in the third arc of the series, Generations 3, things get really wacky. Centuries pass between each of the 12 issues in the arcs, which is confusing enough if you aren't prepared for it. But then, in the final issues, that's when Darkseid invades and time travel rears its convoluted head. In the final battle, Batman and Superman are transported back to the 1930s and the first issue from Generations 1. When the day is finally saved, Supes and Batman lose all their memories and start all over again, basically meaning Generations is one big convoluted circle. And finally, in at number 1, Carol and Marcus. This one is not only confusing, but it's a little disturbing too, which I think might also help to make it even more confusing. So basically, in Avengers 197 from 1980, Carol Danvers, back when she was Miss Marvel, discovers that she's pregnant. She doesn't remember how it happened, and that sweet baby is growing pretty quick. Not 3 issues later, in Avengers 200, Carol pops the little sucker out within days of even finding out that she was pregnant. All the Avengers are like weirdly excited about it, as if it's not the weirdest thing ever, and they treat Carol like she's the unreasonable one for not being excited. The baby, who has been named Marcus, grows up into adulthood in basically hours and reveals that he is actually the son of Immortus, the ruler of Limbo and one of the different incarnations of Kang the Conqueror. Immortus had Marcus with a woman he had apparently plucked out of time, but Marcus was trapped in Limbo until he could be born on Earth. So, Marcus had brought Danvers to Limbo, romanced her with a combination of charm and quote, subtle manipulation from Immortus' machines, and he got Miss Marvel pregnant so he could be born on Earth. The fact that they go on to explore the romance before it was retconned is one thing, but like, scientifically, that actually makes no sense, and it's confusing as hell.
Number 10. What if Daredevil killed the Kingpin? That's exactly what happened in issue number 2 of the 1989 series. Following the events of Born Again in this alternate reality, Matt Murdock loses his mind, driven insane as a result of being tormented by Wilson Fisk, which honestly makes sense to me. I know I would be driven insane if all of that stuff happened to me. This causes Matt to take the fight directly to Kingpin, who he simply takes out by shooting him. After this detail is exposed, everyone is basically on his trail, including Punisher and Spider-Man. When Matt goes to beg for Richard Fisk, Wilson's son's, forgiveness, even Hobgoblin gets involved in this fray. While Matt ultimately dies in the fight protecting Richard from Hobgoblin, Richard, in an unexpected twist, ends up carrying on the Daredevil legacy. Which I guess shouldn't be too unexpected if you know about, 2099, where it's kind of what happens in 2099. And friends, before we move on to our next spot on this list, if you love what we do here at Top 10 Nerd, why don't you show us you love us by clicking that subscribe button. Number 9. What if Spider-Man had joined the Fantastic Four? Now, you'd think this would actually be one of the happier what if stories, considering when Spider-Man started out, this was actually like one of his dreams to join the FF team, but he was denied it. However, in this universe, they do decide to allow Spider-Man to join them, making his dreams come true, but it actually ends up worse than if they just refused him like they did in the main continuity. I also think that this first issue of What If is pretty important as it really sets the tone for what these hypothetical comic stories could be, a look into a much darker reality where not everything goes according to plan. But we don't have to really deal with the consequences long term because, these stories are like windows into other more distant worlds, so they don't affect our main world. We can kind of just see like, I wonder what that world would be like. Terrible? Yep. In issue number 1 of the first volume of What If, Spider-Man ends up joining the Fantastic Four team, which I believe they renamed themselves to the Fantastic Five. Still has a pretty good ring to it actually. When Susan Storm actually makes the suggestion that, maybe letting him join wouldn't be such a bad idea, so Sue is actually the one that kind of gets him on the team ultimately here. But in the end, this results in her feeling often left out, shunted from this team as a result of Spider-Man's impressive presence. He just completely outdoes Sue, so she feels pretty left out. This causes her in the end to choose to remain with Namor, ultimately leaving the Fantastic Five team, something for which Spider-Man blames himself and which leaves a massive hole in the team and a massive hole in Reed's heart. Number 8. What if Spider-Man became a murderer? This is maybe the brightest of the darkest what if stories that I have on this list, but it's still really dark, so hence why it's here, especially at the start here. In issue number 72 of the 1989 What If series, we answer the question, what if Spider-Man became a murderer? Dun dun dun! With him confronting the burglar who killed his Uncle Ben and losing control of his emotions, killing said burglar in turn. This, however, eats Peter up inside, and it isn't until Dr. Kurt Connors becomes the Lizard and decides to fess up to his own actions that Peter is actually inspired and is able to confess to the murder that he was responsible for and reveal that he is the one that's Spider-Man. He does some time, but thanks to him showing remorse, he only gets 5 years, and Aunt May is still waiting for him when he gets out with his costume. It's dark, but it's also kind of cute in the end, because I think one of his biggest concerns was that Aunt May would never love him again, and she is upset, but she eventually gets over it, and she's like, well, this is still my nephew, so kinda nice. Still terrible, but kinda nice. Number 7. What if Daredevil's dad had thrown the big fight? This one actually comes to us from a comic titled What If?, starring Daredevil, the man without fear. But the question posed in the intro is, what if Daredevil's dad had thrown the big fight? Which is that's why I named the point that. It might not seem as dark as some other tales in the what if category, but the intro literally also poses the question in this issue. What if we shed a little light on the dark side of the Marvel Universe? And the story definitely delivers there, I would say. Here, Matt's dad takes the dive for his son and earns the money needed to send him to law school. Sounds pretty good. There, Matt meets Elektra. Also sounds pretty good. The two have a love affair that ends when her father is killed and they're both unable to save him together. Okay, it's starting to turn kinda dark. She leaves and Matt is then forced to deal with his own family tragedy as his father ends up in the hospital after a hit in a fight leaves him comatose. Okay, it's getting darker. Unable to afford the bills, he drops out of school and himself becomes a fighter, but when he is asked to take a dive for a paycheck, he refuses. As punishment, his father is killed, and Elektra returns to encourage Matt to seek retribution. This is where it gets pretty dark, I would say. Matt basically goes after Wilson Fisk with his intention to do it his own way. Now, he doesn't want to kill him, but he just wants to expose him for his illegal business dealings, which is a very Matt Murdock approach, I would say. In the end though, Elektra kills Fisk for Matt, basically during this confrontation, and Matt chooses to incriminate himself in the murder because he feels guilty about Kingpin's death. Yikes. Number 6. What if someone else besides Spider-Man had been bitten by a radioactive spider? This What If comic, issue number 7 from the original series from the 70s, actually has 3 stories in it. In one of them, Flash Thompson tries on the role of superhero, as he ends up becoming the one fatefully bitten by the radioactive spider that day in the science lab on the student field trip. And if you're wondering, well Amanda, you know, Flash Thompson actually has been a hero. I know he's been a hero in the main continuity, but I mean, in this reality he's trying on the superhero role of Spider-Man. He becomes Spider-Man and does his best to be a great hero, but actually dies during his attempt to be one. Sad. He fights the Vulture, and it's during a battle in the sky where the Vulture successfully manages to kick Flash off of him that Flash's Spider-Man falls to the ground. Unable to find much in the way of cushion or slowing his descent, the fall does him in, and Peter Parker finds Spider-Man in the alleyway, unmasking him to recognize the face of Flash Thompson, the ire of his high school experience. Now acknowledging the fact that Flash was Spider-Man though, Peter seems to forget all about this as he actually mourns the loss of Thompson, which makes it even more sad. Number 5. What if the alien costume had possessed Spider-Man? One of my personal favorites and definitely a dark story. This one involves Spider-Man being fully overtaken by his black suit after Reed attempts to remove it. In the end, Peter is drained of his life energy by the suit, which does inevitably leave him. Prematurely aged by this process, he ends up dying of old age, with Black Cat being the one to get revenge for Peter by killing the symbiote for good. It also features a very sad scene between May and old Peter, who poses as a colleague of Peter's from the Daily Bugle and basically comes to tell Aunt May before he dies how much Peter loved her. This sad and tragic what-if tale comes from issue number 4 of the 1989 comic series, if you would like to revisit it, as I have. Number 4. What if the Hulk had killed Wolverine? This story comes to us from issue number 50 of the first volume of the Marvel What If series. Here, Wolverine and the Hulk fight, as, you know, is common, but this time, during their, what I believe is intended to be their first fight, Wolverine ends up dead. This is all because Hulk is being used as a pawn by Forge's powerful nemesis, the Adversary. Very creative name, the Adversary. I wonder what that guy's about. Is he an adversary? He certainly is. In the end, Hulk threatens the lives of pretty much all of the X-Men, but does not end up killing them all. Once the Adversary reveals himself, Hulk attacks him, weakening him briefly, just long enough for Forge and Storm to basically escape his clutches. They strike back against him, and with Forge managing to cast a spell to defeat the Adversary, and basically seals the Adversary off in another realm, banishing him from their reality for good. Still, while there are survivors of this battle, when Hulk transforms back to Bruce Banner, Bruce is confronted with the fact that he has taken multiple lives during this rampage, and that pretty much breaks Bruce, so I would say this is pretty tragic. Number 3. What if the Punisher had killed Spider-Man? This comic has maybe one of the darkest endings around. In it, Punisher is tricked into killing Spider-Man. He's promised basically funds to help him in his fight against crime and those who took his family from him, and Frank is also made to believe that Spider-Man himself is a criminal and is not actually a hero. However, after killing Spider-Man, Frank learns the truth. He manages to track down the man who misguided him, the Jackal, aka Professor Miles Warren. He figures out that the Jackal is Warren, and insists that they wait for the cops instead of just, you know, blowing Warren away. However, when the cops do arrive, it's revealed what Frank's real plan is here, to basically kill the Jackal in front of the cops and in return be killed by the cops, believing he deserves himself to be punished for what he did to poor Spider-Man. This all goes down in What If, issue number 58 from the 1989 series. Does seem like a Frank solution to a problem where he blames himself or something. Number 2. What if Flash Thompson became Spider-Man? I was kind of thinking that maybe in this story, Flash, you know, might get a break here. But even here, he has a pretty bleak tale attached to him in another alternate reality where he also becomes Spider-Man instead of Peter Parker. The story culminates in a heated moment where Peter discovers Flash's secret, that he's Spider-Man. Filled with rage, Flash doesn't listen to Peter's pleas for help and instead blames him for everything that has gone wrong in his life recently, shouting at Peter, "You ruined my life," before hitting him with a deadly punch that that basically cost Peter his life. This story comes from the 2018 What If Spider-Man comic, and I would recommend checking this one out. It's wild. Number 1. What if Phoenix had not died? The title for this story makes it sound like it might even be a positive and happy story, but don't be misguided, it's not happy. Well, it starts off pretty optimistic with the Phoenix not dying but being redeemed and even helping to defeat Galactus. In the end, the Dark Phoenix power does consume Jean, causing her to turn on her teammates, so she becomes, dark again. She kills not just the X-Men, but the world in her rage and sorrow, with her anger and fire continuing to spread outward, engulfing the universe. So not only do her friends die, the X-Men obviously, the world, but like the universe is also completely in danger. So yeah.